I'm so glad to be able to sit down and chat with you because, like I said earlier, I'm a huge fan and I have lots of questions. I'm going to cheat just a little bit and have them with me. But I'm curious. I imagine a lot of you guys here have heard of Apollo 8 as like a mission. Who's like familiar with what it did? So we're going to do the Coles Notes, which is Canadian Cliff Notes, for those of you who are less familiar. So Apollo 8 launched on December 21st of 1968, and it was kind of an insane thing for NASA to do. The lunar module was not ready. Everything was falling behind schedule. After the Apollo 1 fire in January of 1967, NASA had to revise the main spacecraft, the command module, to be safer and less destroy-y to life, which is a terrible way to put it, I apologize. But it was completely rebuilt from an initial Block 1 to a Block 2 model. Everything was basically redone, and NASA's trying to figure out how to regain lost time to still make it to the moon by the end of the decade. So they'd started doing this thing called all-up testing. So instead of putting every little piece of the puzzle together and then adding it, they just did the whole thing all the way up, which is nuts when you're talking about going to the moon. So that's basically what they did with Apollo 8. Apollo 7 was the first manned mission of the Apollo program, and it was just an Earth orbital checkout of this command module rebuilt after the fire, and then they said, well, we don't have a lunar module, so let's just take what we have to the moon. Can't land, but we're going to go into orbit, going to work some stuff out, and then we'll come back and start working with the lunar module. So this was the mission. This is Apollo 8. It was insane. I still think it's insane, but I love it. It's beautiful, and most notably, Apollo 8 is the mission that brought us this famous Earthrise picture, which I'm sure is recognizable to everybody because it's on the cover of like every Time magazine Best Pictures of the Century issue ever. And it's a good one. So, having said that and given you guys a bit of the introduction for those who didn't know what Apollo 8 was, I'm curious to ask you, Jeff, why write a book about Apollo 8, the mission that, well, one of the two missions that didn't land on the moon? What was the impetus for you and the interest here?
It's a very good question, and I've often thought that when the long arc of space history in the 20th century is written, the four most consequential flights will be Yuri Gagarin, first person in space, a single orbit, 88 minutes around the Earth, but that changed everything. We were now a species that could fly above the atmosphere. And then Apollos 8, 11, and 13. Apollo 11, obviously, the first time we got our boots dirty in the soil of another world. Apollo 13, the great mission of disaster survival and imagination. But 8 was more than all of those in some ways. 8 was the paradigm-changing mission for humanity as a species. Ever since we emerged as ooze from a pond and then later got feet, ooze with feet, but we were still making progress. Ever since that moment, we were ground-dwelling creatures who lived at the bottom of an earthly gravity well. By the early 20th century, we had found a way to haul ourselves up from the dirt, to fly through the atmosphere, and then a few decades after that, to fly above the atmosphere, orbiting the Earth in a 150-degree or 150-mile altitude that we dared call space. Well, it was space in a sense, but it was also little more than the equivalent distance between Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. So this isn't exactly like the distant reaches of the galaxy. The pivotal moment came when we decided finally to tear ourselves away from Earth's gravity, to sail across the true deep waters of deep space and enter the gravity well of another world, and that was the moon. There were so many moments in the Apollo 8 mission that seemed to capture, to crystallize the significance of it, but I often found a piece of second-person phrasing that the astronauts used. Amy will agree with me that sometimes it's syntax that makes everything make sense. And at one point, when I think it was Lovell, said during one of the broadcasts that the beauty of the planet makes you realize what you have back on Earth. Just 20 hours in lunar orbit, and he was already thinking of himself as a person of another world. It wasn't what we have back on Earth, it was what you have back on Earth. He said it in passing, but he said it sincerely. And I think that word, that sentence, that thought, captures the paradigm shift of why Apollo 8 was the transformative mission.
So I'm curious, and I'm going off my script here. You mentioned Lovell saying this kind of poignant recognition of his position, his unique position in that moment. It was during that, I think that was the Christmas Eve broadcast.
Christmas Eve, it was, yeah, Christmas Eve broadcast.
Yeah, so the Christmas Eve broadcast, and they're all sort of giving their impressions of it. Have you read the full transcript from Apollo 8?
The air-to-ground beginning.
Yeah.
I have read a lot of it.
Yeah.
I will confess that even as a space junkie, there are some points at which you just cannot read off star coordinates without your eyes glazing over and wanting to kill yourself. But at some point, yes, and I have read all of the consequential parts and have glanced over some of the numbers. But because, I mean, was there a specific thing that?
I was actually, because I've also read it, because that's a fun thing to do apparently. Because I remember when I looked at it on the 45th anniversary, it's those poignant moments of sort of their self-recognition is really what kind of drives home exactly what you were hoping to do with this book and focusing on this mission. But there's also those little human moments where I sort of had that feeling of, how are you talking about bacon when you're at the moon?
Exactly.
Did you feel, did you get into the nitty-gritty of sort of trying to tease out sort of the more mundane elements? Because really going to the moon was a lot of banter.
Yeah, it was a lot of banter, and you've read, of course, there were two kinds of transcripts and recordings made. There was the air-to-ground transcript, which was sanitized and exactly how astronauts were supposed to talk. And then there was a second recording loop that was called the data storage equipment, the DSE tapes, which the astronauts more colloquially called the dump tapes, which meant everything we say will be recorded and dumped. It was a little like the Watergate tapes, except they weren't planning vast constitutional violations. They were simply flying to the moon. And they knew they were being recorded. But it's when you listen to those and read those that you think, yes, this was an epical mission. Yes, these were human beings doing something no human beings had ever done before. They were traveling for their nation, but they were also traveling for Homo sapiens writ large. And yet at the same time, they were still just guys. They were still three guys with lunch bucket names like Frank and Jim and Bill, and they had to get through their days, and they had to eat their bacon cubes, and they had to drink their grape punch because you're not allowed alcohol in space. And you know, there's even a moment when they get this very childish schoolboy banter, and actually this was on one of the air-to-grounds, when Bill Anders says, well, Jim is in the lower equipment bay by himself right now, and I am not going to tell you what he's doing, but suffice to say we've both put on our gas masks. So, I mean, they're little boys. They're behaving the way I would behave if I were there. But then you saw other things. Then you saw them look out the window and see the Earth and see the moon. And astronauts Jack Swigert, not long before he died, gave an interview about why astronauts always speak in what we would consider cliches. They look at the moon, they say things like, wow, fantastic, amazing, awe-inspiring. Well, you could say that, I could say that without ever having gone. He was saying that astronauts can't be poets because you can either go to the moon and have that technical decoupling of what you're doing and therefore be able to be dispassionate, or you can be poetic, in which case you fully realize in an existential way what you're doing, and you would pass out from the panic of the idiocy of where you were. So you have to read through the simplicity and the spareness of their phrasing. But when you hear Frank Borman say something like, oh God, isn't that pretty? That is him having a transcendent experience. So you have to do a little calibration when you read this stuff. But when you read it, you know these guys are deeply moved. And there are also very sweet moments when Frank Borman had two sons, still has two sons, Fred and Ed, which is, I would expect Frank Borman to give his sons two names no more glamorous than Fred and Ed. It rhymes, it's perfect, it's lean, it's practically metric. But you hear him at one point when the other guys are, starting to get bleary and they're getting red-eyed, and, Jim was actually starting to make a few mistakes with the computer, and you could hear it beep every time you made a mistake. And Borman is telling them, all right, guys, you got to get some sleep. And Bill Anders is like the anxious young boy. He was the rookie. He was sort of the puppy of the trip, and he was saying, oh, just let me take a few more pictures. And Borman said, no, guys, you got to go to bed. And Anders says, but just this one more thing. And Borman says, no, this discussion is closed. Get your ass to bed. I mean it. And I realized he's just channeling himself talking to his sons. And Jim sort of goes off and Bill slumps off. But it's a very sweet moment because, as you say, they're doing something that changed humanity, but they're still just three boys in a spaceship.
So I imagine in writing this, you had a chance to talk to those three boys in a spaceship out of the spaceship, obviously. So this is kind of a two-part question, because I'm curious. Having read the transcripts, and I imagine read their memoirs that were written more closely to the event than we are now, and then talking to them, do you see a difference in the way they remember things, if they remember sort of details differently or have different impressions that have changed over time? That's the first half of my question.
The first half of the question, I honestly don't think the details have changed over time. Jim was always very playful about who took the Earthrise picture. It was Anders. Anders was the mission photographer, and when you read the dump tape transcripts, you hear exactly what was going on, and Anders only had black and white film in the camera, and he said to Lovell, get me some color, and Jim dives to the lower equipment bay, and he's reading off a color canister and says something like, well, is the C368? And he says, just as long as it's color, get it to me. And he runs up. So clearly Anders took it. But when I was writing Apollo 13 and I asked Jim, who took the Earthrise picture? He said, me, of course. And I said, really? He said, yes. Or that's what I tell people. And then, of course, when the transcripts were released and everybody saw who it was, and then he admits it. But flash forward 20 more years to just last week before I sent Jim the book, I said, now listen, I want to, just forewarn you, he and I were collaborators. I said, you know that the book, our book, was very Lovell-centric. You were the commander. Well, as it happens, I have the same editor for Apollo 8 that I had for 13. We have never worked together on any other book, and pure serendipity put us back together again. And Jim knew him, so I said, you know the way John wanted Apollo 13 to be centered around you, well, he wanted Apollo 8 to be centered around Frank. So you may read a little more Frank Borman bio before you get to page 45, and then you and Bill come in, and then you'll be fine. And he wrote me back and said, now I know you're just letting me down easy. The next thing you're going to tell me is that you're going to raise that old canard that Bill Anders took the picture. He said, I also want you to remember, I navigated those two characters to the moon. And if you tell me that Tom Hanks is playing Borman in the movie, then I'll be angry. But they did have very different approaches to it, and I'll finish this question quickly. They went to that mission with three very different personalities and expectations. Frank Borman is the first person to admit he's a military man. He's a by-the-book man. He is a patriot down to his last strand of mitochondrial DNA. He's a man who wanted to fight for his country. He went to West Point. He wanted to fight in the Korean War. He had an ear problem that kept him grounded for a year. By the time he was restored to flight status, the next class of hot dog young cadets had come in. He missed his chance, so he had this shot in the Cold War. He was gone on the moon. He was going to punch the Russians in the nose, come home, and then get out of space. Anders loved machines. He loved the lunar module. The lunar module was a preposterous machine. So ugly it was beautiful, so improbably designed that it was really, you really thought, everyone is old enough in this room to have been in the great cannabis days in college. So you really thought it was a machine designed after a bunch of guys did bong hits, and they came up with a LAM. Bill Anders loved the LAM. He loved the command module. He just loved the hardware. Jim Lovell just loved being in space. He was just never as happy as when he was in space, and he was never as happy in space as when he was doing some crazy-ass thing like flying to the moon for the first time. So they all came at it from very different temperaments, but it was all mission-critical, mission-focused. And I think that very complementary variety of their temperaments and their goals and their aptitudes was what made the mission perfect.
Who else did you talk to in doing this? Was it just the crew, or did you get to talk to any flight directors? Because I'm always curious to see who remembers things and who gets, you know, feisty about certain details.
Yeah.
And like, did you have any like fun moments where you're like, oh, I wish I could write this in a book, but you're just ragging on me for making fun of you right now, like Lovell saying, you know, don't bring up the picture thing, I want that credit still.
Right.
Do you have any of those little personal details you can share, not in print?
There are, I mean, human mortality being what it is, unfortunately, there were a lot more people for me to interview when I wrote Apollo 13 20-some years ago than there are now. So the handful of people I interviewed afresh this time was, you know, it was fewer than 10 people, but it was Gene Kranz again, which was wonderful. It was all three astronauts. It was Mike Collins. I forget who else. They're all listed in the back of the book. But I also had a deep body of interviews I had done years before, and a lot of it wasn't used again. I have found these folks universally welcome to, and indeed enthusiastic about having these stories told, because they know who they were. They know what they were doing. I think it was Jerry Bostick, and I forget if I say this in the book or not, or if it made it through the editing, but Jerry Bostick, or one of the other ground controllers, said a sort of silent reminder to himself, sort of a silent prayer when he was in the control room that night, thanking God or thanking good fortune for allowing him to be in this place at this moment with a particular set of skills he had. He may have been born with a different set of skills. He may have been born 10 years later. He may have been born at the same time with the same skills, but been sick for a year and so missed out on his opportunities. Circumstances conspired to put these men, and they were all men, in the front rooms and the back rooms, as we have learned more vividly now by Hidden Figures and other such stories. Women played a deeply important role, but they didn't get the credit at the time, and the guys in the front trenches were all guys. So they were very happy to have their stories told. I don't recall anybody who got cranky about anything except Chris Kraft, who was, I love Chris Kraft. I admire Chris Kraft. He is brilliant, whip smart, wound as tightly as a mainspring that is about to self-combust. He's an amazing guy. But I also think at some level Chris Kraft has been in a bad mood since birth. And I mean that in all the good ways. He's very cranky. And he said something to me on tape in Apollo, when I was interviewing him for Apollo 13. He said, Susan Borman was so mad at me for sending Frank on a lunar orbit instead of just a circumlunar that she didn't talk to me for 2 years after that. All right, I got it on tape. I got it in transcript. I wrote it in the book. Kraft denied it. And when his book came out, he said, he blamed it on Lovell instead of Lovell's and my collaboration. He said, well, and when Jim Lovell's book came out, he said that Susan and I didn't talk for 2 years. I guess he missed all the wonderful conversations we had at cocktail parties. And from such errors is history made. And I bristled and was, you know, I'm a journalist. My integrity is based on these things. So this was pre-digital recording, so I took my little cassette recorder and held it up next to another cassette recorder and recorded the recording, and it was a little snippet, and then I wrote a letter, polite but pointed, and mailed it out. And Chris Kraft did exactly what I should have expected Chris Kraft to do, and what Chris Kraft was entitled to do when someone like me writes him a letter like that, which was to ignore it completely. I never heard back from him, and that's okay, because whether I was right or whether I was wrong, you know, he's protecting NASA's history as he sees it. But for the most part, They're all wonderful people, and not just for the most part. So is Kraft. He's a man who has my profound admiration. I do think my takeaway there is that they like talking about this history because they want people to know how important it was.
Mm-hmm. Which is great. Well, they're still willing to do it. I've heard some interesting stories. Yeah, I asked the weird questions though, like about tuna.
Tell me about the tuna. Did we just?
This was on Apollo 12.
Yeah.
This is one of my favorite stories, that there was Dick Gordon wanted to eat a can of tuna that had been opened for 8 hours. And he asked if whoever, I forget who was on, I think it was Jerry Carr, was Capcom, and said, is it safe because it's been exposed to pure oxygen for 8 hours? And they said, well, we need to get back to you on that. And they took it to the flight surgeons in the back to try to figure out what could happen to tuna that's been open that long. When would if he got food poisoning, when would that happen in the mission? It was an hour-long discussion by the smartest men and women in the world who were sending people to a precision landing on the moon. They could not figure out what to do about this can of tuna. And even it got to the point that Dick Gordon's wife came down and weighed in on it, his then wife, and said, please don't eat the tuna. Just don't eat the tuna. And I asked him about it last year. And he didn't remember it at all. I showed him the transcript, this whole conversation about tuna, and he's laughing so hard he's crying. He said, probably ate the damn thing and just never tell them about it. It's like, well, these are the little details that you're like, well, yes, exactly like you said, they are men doing something that changed history, but they were also just men and pilots at that. I mean.
Yeah. Well, you remember the story about John Young on the moon with his air recirculation problem in his spacecraft. John Young was on the surface of the moon. They had asked them to eat a lot of oranges, because oranges are apparently heavy in potassium. So they ate a lot of oranges at the request of NASA. Tang was sponsoring the coverage. And you hear John Young on the surface of the moon, talking to Charlie Duke on the surface of the moon, saying, I got him again, Charlie. I got the farts. I have to tell you. He said, I don't mind the occasional orange, but I hate being buried in them. I'm just not eating anymore. And you're on the surface of the moon. It's not exactly like you can open your helmet, air things out, and shut it down again. The Tang people were cross.
And I only know this because I do this thing where I live tweet Apollo missions on their 85th or their 45th anniversaries. So I live tweet missions on their 45th anniversaries. That's why I've read the transcript.
You are the greatest person in the world, I have to tell you.
Please tell me someone recorded that so that I can have that for posterity. And we just passed the 45th anniversary of Apollo 16, and they did following up on the fart story, that they did a live press conference on the way back to the moon. I think it was their day out, and someone had brought up this issue of why John Young suddenly doesn't like fruit. He's a Florida boy. Is he turning his back on his home state and the citrus that they produce? And it just became this big issue that he had sworn off ever eating another orange, and he was from Florida. And apparently, I don't know if it was the Board of Tourism or someone, but this became a thing that NASA was like, you're gonna have to be careful about this, because the issue was they didn't know that their mics were hot. They had the link between the two of them, of course, for the radio, and then they would turn that off to talk to the ground where they would not be cursing. Because I see some younger ears in here, so I won't say it, but the uncensored transcript is, I've got the effing farts again. Yeah. Just yep, that went live to the entire world. Which is great. Again, they're human, and I love that. So you've mentioned that you co-wrote Lost Moon with Jim Lovell, which is, if anybody has not read it, it's amazingly gripping and brilliant. So did that influence, you've said that sort of the big missions are sort of Gagarin, Apollo 8, 11, and 13. Did having worked with Jim Lovell so closely on 13 influence you to sort of be more interested in his missions, or was this an interest that you had in these missions growing up and seeing it happen and just personally before meeting them?
That is it's another really good question, and the answer, whether it was one or the other, the answer is basically yes, and I'll tell you why. First of all, my feeling by the time Apollo 13 rolled around was, if you knew space and you were trying to pick your favorite astronaut, any fool could say John Young or Neil Armstrong, but you had to be a connoisseur to pick Jim Lovell, and I considered myself a connoisseur. It's like Tom Hanks once referred to the ABC newsman, Jules Bergman. He said, my science reporter of choice, and that's the way I felt about Jim. I just liked something about him. I liked something about his temperament. I liked the fact that Apollo 13 was his 4th mission, that he had flown on Gemini 7, which was a nasty bad 2 weeks of 2 guys sealed shoulder to shoulder in a spacecraft that was like you and someone else being in 2 coach seats, but the overhead is 3 inches above your head and you can never open the window. Frank described it as 2 weeks in a men's room. So he had flown that flight, he flew Gemini 12, he flew Apollo 8, and now he was on his way back to the moon. And when I was a kid and I knew he wasn't going to land, I was heartbroken, and because I know he ain't gone back. This guy's not going back a 5th time. He lost his chance to get. It's a little like whatever your politics are. It's a little like Al Gore or Hillary Clinton. You win the popular vote and you don't get to be president. Even if it was a different party, it would be horrible so that's the way I felt about Jim. So I wanted to write the story of Apollo 13 because I thought it was a little told story. It was a hair-raising story. It was a gripping story. It had everything a story needed. It has high stakes, life and death. It has a ticking clock. You got 5 or 6 days before you die. It has a dramatic setting. The moon's pretty good when you're looking for dramatic settings. It had a single charismatic hero around whom the story could orbit. And it was confined in just 6 days. I called, before I did the book, proposed the book, I called my uncle Richard Kluger, whom I never tire of boasting, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1997 for his book Ashes to Ashes on the history of the Philip Morris companies. An amazingly accomplished man. And he said as a first book, this is a great idea because all the elements are there and it's small enough to get your arms around. So I did that book and I worked with Jim, and every single thing about Jim projected decency, projected wisdom, projected approachability. I'm not pretending I wasn't at first a total fanboy. One of the first times, or maybe the first time I spoke to him on the phone, he was calling from a 1992 car phone. Well, you know, those things were the size of a shoe, and you know, the reception was terrible. And I was talking to him, trying to keep myself together, and the reception was awful, and as soon as I hung up, I called my agent and I said, it sounded just like he was calling from the moon. It was so exciting, I can't believe it. But Jim was the perfect collaborator because we deferred to one another's strengths. He knew that I'm the reporter, I'm the writer, so, you know, give me the call there, and I knew he's the guy who flew to the moon twice, so give him the call on everything else. But the grace notes in Jim were what struck me. There was right toward the end of our project, when the book was out, the movie was out, Apollo 13 was everywhere. Jim was experiencing a level of fame, renewed fame, that he had experienced before, and his fame before was even greater. I was experiencing a level of recognition I had never experienced before. In some respects, haven't experienced since. And Jim said to me one night, and he's not a sentimental guy, but he said to me one night when we were on the phone, he said, listen, I just want you to remember where you are standing on the stage when the spotlight goes off, because it will go off, it always goes off. And no one who walked you out there is going to be there to help you back off. So you got to remember the ebb and flow of this kind of recognition. And I thought, this is the greatest man I've ever met in my life. So when I had the opportunity to revisit a mission, it was just one of my great joys and great privileges to be able to do another mission that involved Jim. I was out there with my family in the summer of 2012. We stayed at the Lovels home. And my daughters, who are only 16 and 14 now, I started late, who were 11 and 9 at the time. And Jim took us to the Museum of Science and Industry to see Apollo 8. And I pulled my daughters aside and said, ladies, I know you may not be old enough to appreciate this right now, but this is Columbus showing you the Santa Maria, and you are in a rare position to see that. And I think they did get that, and it stayed with them about until we got back to the house, and then they got to play with the Lovell's Irish Setter or Golden Retriever Toby again, and then everything was lost in the face of Toby. But I think they kept that with them over the years.
Did you take pictures of them with Jim in front of Apollo 8 so you can remind them that that happened?
Yeah, I took pictures there, and I took pictures of him leaning over with my wife and daughters, showing them Earthrise, and I thought, I can die a happy man.
Yeah, even if they didn't appreciate it then, they'll appreciate it eventually. And just speaking of, this just popped into my head, speaking of Apollo 13 being everywhere, did you know that there was a movie tie-in pinball game made of Apollo 13?
I did not.
It is very bizarre. The Pinball Hall of Fame in Las Vegas has it. It is a bizarre place, but you shoot the pinball through a Saturn V towards the moon. It's amazing. And it's got audio from the movie blaring at you and the soundtrack. It's bizarre.
I really want to own that. When we were first doing the book, I have a wonderful agent, a woman named Joy Harris, independent agent, only agent I've ever had, longest standing relationship in my life, practically, besides family members. And right at the time when I was with her, we had just started, also Jim was represented by William Morris, much bigger agency. And they brought me over and were sort of, trying to get me to jump camps and join William Morris. And I stayed with Joy, best decision of my life. But I said to Jim as we left, because they promised us all kinds of spin-offs, and I said, Jim, the only thing they did not promise us was the Apollo 13 gummy bears. And I'm sure if we had stayed for another hour, they would have gotten that in.
That's pretty good. So, again, this popped into my head. I heard an interesting story, and I don't know if you were in this meeting or not, but the only person in this whole world that I'm sort of friends with is Jerry Griffin, who was an Apollo flight director, and he's absolutely lovely, and I've never seen him without a beer in his hand, to the point where I think he always has a beer in his hand. He's just great. And he told me that when he, and I think it was him, Jerry Bostick, Glenn Lunny, and I don't know if you were in that meeting, met with Ron Howard in Mission Control, the old Mission Control, to discuss making an Apollo 13 movie, because Jerry Griffin was, of course, one of your technical advisors, that they were telling the story, and the three of them or four of them, however many were there, said, they kind of retold it and said, this isn't a movie. We just did our jobs. Why is that interesting? Were you in that meeting?
I was not in that meeting, but that doesn't surprise me a bit, because I think that's the way they saw it. Look, they were aware they were doing something deeply cool, but they also knew that they had to stay focused on the work they were doing. It's more than Mission Control was a windowless room because it had to be, but that's also a rich metaphor for what that period was for these guys. When you ask them about what was going on in the outside world, the riots and the war and the invasion of Czechoslovakia and everything, all the terrible things that happened that year, they said, yeah, we knew it, but it was out there. And, as I describe it in the book, I said it was sort of just a dim flashing and a dull thumping through a very thick scrim. They knew they had a job to do, and they focused on that job. The thing that amazes me is Gene Kranz, not all that long ago, told me, he said, you looked around that room. The average age there was 26. These were today's Silicon Valley kids, except they weren't working for Silicon Valley pay. They were working for government paychecks, doing this extraordinary thing in this extraordinary time. And it was, to them, just a job. But it was a job that at one point or another, they all realized they were sublimely lucky to have. And I think that's something about all of them. They were just focused. They were just dedicated. There were 400,000 people, from the three guys in the spacecraft down to the last person on the last assembly line at the last subcontractor's factory. 400,000 people. And they were all focused on this one goal: get human footprints, American footprints, onto the moon before December 31st, 1969 at midnight. And they did it.
So going back to Apollo 8, since that's what we're supposed to be talking about, we're midway between oh well, golly, I can't math. This is the, 48th, 49th anniversary of the flight?
December will be the 49th.
Yeah. So why a book about Apollo 8 now? Why not hold it and try to grab onto that big 50?
For a couple of reasons. First of all, I just really wanted to write it, and I have no deferred gratification skills. That was part of it. Second of all, I have, funnily enough, the anniversaries do sometimes make a difference, but I have also found, and we find this at time in journalism too, sometimes anniversaries also don't really make a whole lot of difference. When I wrote my Jonas Salk book, by pure coincidence, it came out in 2005, which was the 50th anniversary of the vaccine, and it got me a few more events, but it didn't seem to make a big difference. By pure coincidence, which I didn't know until I got the contract for the book, and we had just gotten the deal, the very next day I called Jim and said, hey, I'm back in the Apollo game. I want to come talk to you about 8. And he said, well, there's actually another guy out there who's writing a book now. And I thought, oh no. And there was. I'm not sure of the fate of that book. And I just figured then I got to work fast. So it was one of the reasons I worked quickly on it. But it also came from a funny series of events. I wrote the 2 magical realism young adult novels, which one of them really I think is meant more for college age. But I was out having lunch with my editor from Philomel, which is the publishing house I do for YA, and she said, you know, nonfiction is big for kids these days. Are there any nonfiction stories you want to tell? And I mentioned my Jonas Salk book could make a great book. I mean, it's about kids, it's about saving kids. And she's saying, yeah, viruses and spinal paralysis are not exactly hot topics for children. That's a good point. And I told her the Apollo 8 story. And as you say, Amy, there's, you know, so many people aren't aware of it. And she is, I guess she's in her late 30s, she's an incredibly smart, worldly woman. But she also, as someone who isn't quite yet 40, just hadn't tumbled to that. So she said, I am bowled over by the fact that that story exists, and I think it would make a great YA book. Now the fact is, to do the work it would have required me to do just as much research for a YA book, a young adult book, as I would for an adult book, but for just a fraction of the revenue, and I have 2 daughters in private school, so I got to keep them there. So we agreed, so go out and do an adult book, and then we will do a young adult version of it, and that book will come out next year. It's called To the Moon with an exclamation point. And it's been distilled down by a terrific editor named Ruby Shamir, who is the editor, and just since it seems wrong to be in someone else, in my own book event and plug in another book, but my wonderful editor at Philomel, a woman named Jill Santopolo, and she has a romance novel, but not, I mean, a thoughtful, smart romance novel out called The Light We Lost right now. I'm halfway through it, and I'm absolutely adoring it. So when you have finished Apollo 13, please, I mean Apollo 8 first, I could recommend a great read by a really good writer.
So speaking of Apollo 8 and Apollo 13, if you had to pick a favorite Apollo mission, which one and why?
Well, Apollo 13 got me a co-op in New York, so, so that helped. And by the way, when people say, wow, you must have made a lot of money for Apollo 13, let me tell you as a writer, you think you make a lot of money for a movie like that when you're a writer, you make it by writer's standards. So being the richest guy at the poorhouse is still, it's actually, it was nice, but it was not a mercantile exercise. It was an exercise in joy. So Apollo 13 did that for me. I think Apollo 8, though, is the poetry mission. I think Apollo 8 is, again, the mission that changed who we were, that changed what Homo sapiens' view of themselves was. This picture this picture, it's so familiar to us that it is, you know, it's almost, we don't see it almost anymore. It's like Mount Rushmore, you know, it takes a while before you say, yeah, there are 4 faces in a mountain, and I've seen it a million times, and then you stop and think, there's 4 faces in a mountain? How did they get there? And I think it's a little bit like this. You see Earthrise, you see it on stamps, you see it on cups, you see it everywhere, and then you think, holy smokes, that was the first time we saw ourselves that way. You know, one of the points I make in the book is that even from orbit, the Earth was still way too close to be a circle. It was simply the horizon below your spacecraft. It's a little different from the way you see the horizon below an airplane. It just happens to be a little bit higher. When Apollo 8 had moved far enough away from Earth, and it didn't take long, because when they first lit out of Earth orbit, they were going very fast. They were going 24,200 miles an hour, which you can do the arithmetic. You know, 2 hours later, they were 50,000 miles from Earth, which was 50 times farther than any human being had ever gotten. And when the Earth turned into a circle, a sphere, hanging in space, I think that made everything different. You know, when you were little, or even now, and you would lay in bed and you would have that thought that all kids eventually have, well, if the universe is infinite, that doesn't make any sense because everything has to stop, so there's got to be a wall. But what's behind the wall? Well, more infinite. Or maybe the wall goes on forever, but that has to stop, so what's behind the wall? More infinite. And you get a little panicked, and then you run and tell your parents you can't sleep, and then you try to put that kind of thought out of your mind. I still, as a science writer, I still look at bodies hanging in space, and since we evolved in a 1G environment, stuff that's hanging is supposed to fall. So when I look at a sphere hanging in space, I think, it's just there. It is naked in space. It's fragile. It's destructible. It was like, it's perfect that it was Christmas season, because that is a Christmas tree ornament of blue and white glass. Nothing looks more destructible than the Earth hanging in space. And I think, you know, by the time Apollo 10 went back around the moon, and 11 and 12 and 13 and all of the others, we were used to that. But this is the one that woke us up to what we were.
I'm curious whether you've seen the Lunar Reconnaissance orbiter team created, they did a visualization using the Apollo 8 audio of taking the picture of this Earthrise. Have you seen that?
I have seen it, and I think Andy Chaikin might have done the voiceover.
Yeah. Okay. Because that, if anybody has not seen that, I think you can just look up LRO Apollo 8 Earthrise, and it's this beautiful visualization of exactly how the spacecraft was spinning to get this image with the time-stamped transcript audio. It's awesome.
And they actually figured out from when, I mean, obviously the lunar surface is washed out here, but in the real pictures, there's some pretty crisp detail of exactly what the topography was. So knowing where they were in the mission and the degrees that the Earth was above the horizon at the time and the altitude the crew was flying, they pretty much pictured, are able to determine precisely the spot on the moon that the spacecraft was orbiting over.
It's pretty awesome. So there's this weird resurgence of Apollo 8 style missions coming back into vogue right now. We've got, I mean, I don't think this is ever going to go, but the Inspiration Mars mission, which is basically doing a free, I don't know if this is coming, I have no idea where their money is, I don't know if it's been shelved, but this is basically the free return trajectory around Mars. NASA has talked about taking EFT-1, the first mission on the SLS, to put people in it and send that on a free return trajectory around the moon, and now SpaceX wants to do the exact same thing. I have my opinions on it. I'm curious if you have any thoughts for sort of why we should or should not be doing something like this. And
I have a lot of thoughts on it, and funnily, I wrote something about this today, an essay that I'm pitching for something. I think there are a lot of things going on. First of all, I think that the opportunities are simply there. The SLS, which is the 21st century Saturn V, and the Orion, which is the 21st century Apollo, are finally, slowly approaching their first flights. And they want them to be, there's no reason to make them Earth orbital flights. We can do circumlunar. It's supposed to be a deep flight spacecraft anyway. You do want to keep it simple, however. So yeah, you fly this thing for the first time. It could be an Apollo 7 type flight, go into Earth orbit and see if it works, but it's almost just as easy as at this point to fly circumlunar. And you also test high-speed deep space reentry, which is important. So I think there's a lot of purely pragmatic reason to do it. But it will wake people up again to the fact that we can do this thing that we haven't been able to do in 50 years. It will inspire people again. It'll make us know that we're capable, that a government that cannot keep the lights on in Washington without a continuing resolution for 3 months just to keep printing the Social Security checks, which is kind of the basic function of government, can do these big, ambitious, inspiring things. Elon Musk, I like Elon. I find Elon a colorful character. I have often said that when I like him and I admire him, but I met him once and I said, he's so hypnotic when he speaks and he's so compelling when he speaks that it's a little like 50 Shades of Grey. You need a safe word to make him stop. So at some point, just, I can't take it anymore, stop talking, Elon. My head is going to explode. And yet I admire him. So if Elon Musk wants to tweak the government a little bit and say, you guys do it, or I'll do it first, I don't mind that a bit. He may be overstating it, but I don't mind that a bit. China is making moon noises, but China promised a landing by 2020, and then China stepped back and said, we don't know how to do this yet. So I think they're getting schooled quickly on how hard it can be if you've never done it before. I am fully in favor of that, and I am fully in favor of a circum-Mars mission, a circum-Martian mission, if people are able to pull it off. I think whatever it takes to re-energize and reanimate people and get the public interested again in demanding this from their government. Look, I was having a conversation with somebody today that even when the emissaries of mankind, of humankind, are robots, we are beside ourselves with excitement. When the Curiosity rover landed on Mars, there were crowds in Times Square watching it play out on the jumbotrons. There were no people on that spacecraft. There were overnight parties at the American Museum of Natural History, and I think at the Griffith Observatory, and at the Air and Space Museum, and at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Parents and kids with sleeping bags staying up late watching this, and they stood and they whooped. You were describing before we spoke about being there and seeing a similar experience when New Horizons passed Pluto. We love these machines because they are extensions of us, because they go places and do things. I saw Cassini when it was on the floor of the factory, or the construction floor at Jet Propulsion Laboratory about 2 years before it launched. I was up on a catwalk behind bulletproof glass. The room was pressurized. The people were there in booties. And I looked at that thing and thought that this machine is just an agglomeration of earthly material, metal and rubber and silicon and all these other earthly materials. And it is here in Pasadena. And within a few years, it will become a thing of here. It will go from being a thing of here to a thing of there, to a thing orbiting Saturn. That is extraordinary that we can do that. We can build machines and place them in these spots. So the fact that our non-human, non-organic proxies do those things, and that excites us so much. When people with names and faces and families and smiles and detectably different voices are on those machines, it's exponentially more moving to us. So if it takes circumlunar, circum-Mars to get people to remember that, I am absolutely in favor of it.
I feel like that's a really uplifting note, just because we're running close on time and I want to give you time to talk to people and get you guys to get your book signed. So sorry to run out of time, but thank you so much for sharing all this. This was really fun. I really appreciate it.